The wind that evening howled across the prairie like it carried old sins in its throat, rattling the shutters of the weather-beaten ranch house and stirring up dust that had not been touched since the days when cattle ruled the land and men spoke little but meant every word they said. And up in the attic of that lonely house, where cobwebs hung thick as lace curtains and the scent of aged cedar lingered heavy in the air, Clara Whitmore pushed aside a cracked wooden trunk and found something that made her heart hitch harder than a spooked Mustang. A leather-bound journal, worn thin at the edges, tied shut with a faded strip of rawhide, and marked on the front with initials she knew all too well. J.M. Clara had come back to the ranch after burying her father beneath a cottonwood tree by the creek, same place her mother rested, and she had sworn she would sell the place quick and leave behind the memories that clung like burrs to a riding skirt. But the moment she saw those initials burned into the leather, she felt the past rise up around her like a dust storm, because there had only ever been one man in this county with those letters stitched into the lining of his saddle blanket. Jesse McCall, the quiet cowboy who once worked her father's land and who rode away 5 years ago without so much as a backward glance, or so she had always believed. She told herself she would not open it, told herself that whatever secrets lay inside were better left to rot with the dust and the mice, yet her fingers betrayed her, tugging loose the rawhide string and easing the cover back, and the first page, written in strong slanted ink that had not yet faded despite the passing years, stopped the breath in her lungs, because it did not speak of cattle or storms or wages owed. It spoke of her, of the way Clara laughed when the hens escaped their coop, of the stubborn tilt of her chin when she argued about breaking horses, of the sunlight catching in her hair one summer afternoon by the riverbank, and she sank down onto the attic floor as though someone had cut the strings holding her upright. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant across the plains, but Clara heard only the scratch of remembered voices, Jesse's slow drawl echoing in her mind, the way he used to tip his hat and say, "Miss Clara," like it was a title fit for a queen rather than a rancher's daughter with calloused hands, and she turned the page with shaking fingers, finding entry after entry dated back nearly a decade, each one a quiet confession, each one proof that the man she thought indifferent had been watching, noticing, remembering every small thing about her life, as though it mattered more than the rising price of beef or the threat of drought. She remembered the night he left, how the sky had burned orange at sunset and her father had stood stiff-backed on the porch while Jesse saddled his horse without a word, how Clara had waited for him to say something, anything, that would make sense of the sudden goodbye, but he only nodded once and rode off toward the horizon, and she had told herself he was like all cowboys, restless as the wind and twice as unreliable. Yet here in her hands lay pages that spoke of sleepless nights spent worrying over her happiness, of silent prayers whispered under wide western skies, of love so steady and stubborn it seemed carved into bone. The attic groaned as the storm gathered strength, rain beginning to drum against the tin roof in uneven rhythm, and Clara read on, finding passages about the first time she beat Jesse at target practice and laughed until she nearly fell over, about the day her father fell ill and Jesse stayed up all night tending the horses so she could rest, about how he knew he had no right to court her while he worked for her family, not with townsfolk ready to gossip and her father proud as a prize bull, and her chest tightened with the realization that what she had taken for distance had been restraint, what she had mistaken for coldness had been sacrifice. A photograph slipped from between the pages, drifting down to the attic floor like a fallen leaf, and Clara picked it up to find an old picture of herself at 17, hair braided, eyes bright with dreams she had long since tucked away, and on the back Jesse had written, "She deserves more than I can offer, but I would give her the world if I had it," and tears blurred her vision, because no man had ever spoken such words aloud to her. No suitor from town with polished boots and rehearsed compliments had ever looked at her the way Jesse's ink now revealed he always had, with quiet awe and fierce devotion. By the time the storm broke fully overhead, lightning splitting the sky and rain washing the prairie clean, Clara reached the last written page, dated only 6 months ago, long after Jesse had supposedly vanished into some far-off territory, and the words there struck harder than any thunderclap. "I am riding back before winter. If she will not have me, I will still see her once more, for a man ought not carry love unspoken to his grave." And Clara's heart pounded like hooves on hard ground, because winter had come and gone, and she had seen no sign of him, which meant either he had changed his mind, or something had happened on the long road home. And as she clutched the journal to her chest, the prairie no longer felt empty, it felt full of questions. And somewhere out beyond the storm-soaked fields, she sensed that Jesse McCall's story was not yet finished. By morning the storm had passed, leaving the prairie scrubbed clean and shining beneath a pale stretch of sky. But Clara Whitmore felt anything but clear. The journal pressed tight against her ribs as she stood on the porch of the old ranch house and looked out over land that suddenly seemed to whisper his name in every bend of grass and every distant fence post. And though reason told her to stay put, to mind her father's cattle and the repairs still needed before summer heat rolled in, her heart urged something wilder, because the last page of Jesse McCall's journal was not a farewell. It was a promise, and a cowboy's promise, once made, was meant to be kept even if the keeping of it cost him everything. She saddled her father's old bay mare with hands steadier than she felt inside, tucking the journal into her saddlebag as though it were a map, for in truth that is what it had become. A guide not only to Jesse's heart, but to the places he mentioned in passing. The North Ridge, where he liked to watch the sunset, the trading post near the dry creek bed, the distant cattle town of Red Hollow, where he once spoke of earning enough to buy a sliver of land of his own. And Clara reasoned that if he had ridden back before winter as he claimed, someone along that route would have seen him, would remember a tall, quiet cowboy with eyes like storm clouds and a habit of tipping his hat when he spoke her name. The ride to Red Hollow took half a day beneath a sun that showed no mercy, the road stretching long and dusty before her, and as Clara passed familiar stretches of prairie, she found herself recalling the journal's confessions, lines where Jesse wrote of trailing behind her during cattle drives just to make sure she rode safe, of fixing broken fence posts before dawn so she would not have to strain her hands, of counting the freckles across her nose as though they were constellations guiding him home. And each memory stung sweet and sharp at once, for she had never known, had never guessed that love had been walking beside her all those years dressed in silence. Red Hollow rose from the flat land like a stubborn scar, its wooden buildings weathered but standing firm, the saloon doors already swinging wide, though it was barely past noon, and Clara rode straight down the main street, with her spine straight and her jaw set, ignoring the curious glances of townsfolk who knew her by name but rarely saw her ride alone into Cattletown. And she dismounted outside the general store first, tying her mare with practiced ease before stepping inside where the scent of flour and tobacco hung thick in the air. Old Mr. Harper, who had sold feed to her father for 20 years, peered at her over the rim of his spectacles and offered a nod. And when she asked about Jesse McCall, about whether he had passed through before winter, the old man's brows knit together in thought before he answered, slow and careful, saying he did recall Jesse stopping by late autumn, buying supplies enough for a long ride, and asking after the Whitmore ranch. But there had been trouble brewing that season, a gang cutting across territories and stealing cattle under cover of early frost, and Jesse had mentioned heading west first, to settle a debt or square something away before riding home. Clara's pulse quickened at that, because nowhere in the journal had Jesse written of debts or enemies, only of hopes and fears and plans to return, and she pressed Mr. Harper for more. But the old man could offer little beyond rumor, that a group of riders had been seen near the canyon pass, that shots were heard one cold night when the first snow dusted the ground, and that come spring no bodies were found, but neither were all the men accounted for, and Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her boots, the edges of possibility widening into something darker than she had dared imagine. She left the store with gratitude on her lips, but worry coiled tight in her chest, and instead of turning back toward home, she crossed the street to the saloon, because if there were stories of gunfire and shadowed riders, they would have taken root there among whiskey glasses and poker tables. And the moment she stepped through the swinging doors, the hum of voices dipped low, men eyeing her presence with a mix of respect and surprise, for Clara Whitmore was known as capable and proud, but not as a woman who chased ghosts across county lines. At the far end of the bar sat a man she recognized from years past, Thomas Hale, once a ranch hand under her father before drifting toward less honest company, and when she spoke Jesse's name, his gaze flickered with something she could not yet name, guilt perhaps, or fear, and after a long pull from his glass, he muttered that Jesse had indeed ridden west toward the canyon pass, chasing after that cattle gang, claiming he would not let thieves run roughshod over land belonging to decent folk, and the last Hale had seen of him was near the mouth of the canyon, as snow began to fall thick and sudden. Jesse riding straight into the narrowing cliffs with resolve carved into his features, and Clara felt a chill despite the heat of the room, because if he had gone alone into outlaw territory with winter closing in, then the promise written in that attic journal might have cost him more than she was ready to bear. And for the first time since opening those pages, hope tangled tight with fear in equal measure. Clara did not ride back toward the safety of her ranch, not with the taste of truth and danger mixed sharp on her tongue. Instead, she turned her mare westward as the sun began its slow descent, the journal resting heavy in her saddlebag like both compass and burden, and the prairie seemed to stretch wider than ever before, empty yet watchful, as though it knew she was crossing from memory into reckoning, because the canyon pass Thomas Hale had spoken of was no gentle dip in the land. It was a jagged scar of stone and shadow, where men with loose morals and quick triggers often disappeared without so much as a marker left behind. By dusk she reached the mouth of the canyon, cliffs rising tall on either side, their faces stained dark by seasons of rain and wind, and Clara dismounted to study the ground the way her father once taught her, searching for tracks preserved in hardened earth. And though months had passed since winter's first snow, she found faint impressions of horseshoes pressed deep where the soil remained sheltered from the sun, some prints scattered and uncertain, others steady and purposeful, and she whispered Jesse's name into the stillness, not as a plea but as a vow that she would not turn back without answers. The canyon narrowed as she led her mare inward, the air cooling and shadows lengthening around her boots. And there, against a bend where rock curved like a half-closed fist, she spotted something that stole her breath, a scrap of leather caught on a thorny bush, worn and familiar, and when she reached for it, her fingers trembled, because stitched faint along its edge were the same initials she had traced in the attic, J.M., and she closed her eyes for a long moment, steadying herself against the weight of what that fragment meant, that Jesse had been here, had ridden into this stone-walled corridor chasing justice or debt, or perhaps both. A sudden clatter of shifting gravel echoed deeper within the pass, and Clara's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at her hip. Her father's old Colt, balanced and ready, and from the shadows stepped a figure lean and weathered, hat pulled low, beard thicker than she remembered, yet eyes unmistakable even in the dim light, storm grey and fixed on her with disbelief. And the world seemed to tilt on its axis as Jesse McCall stood there, flesh and bone and breathing, not a ghost, not a grave left unmarked, but alive and staring at her as though she were the apparition. For a heartbeat neither of them spoke, the canyon holding its breath alongside them. Then Jesse removed his hat slow and careful, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment, and he said her name the way he always had, Miss Clara, though it came rougher now, edged with months of hardship, and she felt anger surge up to meet the relief flooding her chest, because this man who had filled page after page with devotion had left her to grieve a loss she never understood, and she demanded to know why he had not ridden home as promised before winter claimed the plains. Jesse's gaze dropped briefly before meeting hers again, steady and unflinching, and he told her of the gang he had tracked into the canyon, of a skirmish that left 2 men wounded and the rest scattered, of a bullet that grazed his side, and a fall from his horse that shattered bone and left him stranded when early snow blocked the narrow exit, and how a reclusive trapper, living deep within the cliffs, had found him half frozen and nursed him back to strength through the long, cruel months. And by the time Jesse could ride again, pride and doubt had taken root inside him, whispering that a man who vanished without word did not deserve a warm welcome at the Whitmore Ranch. Clara listened without interruption, the journal's words echoing in her thoughts, the lines where he feared he had little to offer, where he believed she deserved more than a hired hand with calloused palms and uncertain prospects. And when he finished she stepped closer despite the ache still visible in his stance, telling him she had found his journal tucked away in her attic, that she had read every confession and every silent prayer he had never dared speak aloud, and that she would have chosen hard winters and narrow means over a life wondering what might have been. And for the first time since she had known him, Jesse's composure cracked, emotion rising raw and honest across his features. The wind wound softly through the canyon then, no longer howling but carrying a gentler note, as though even the land approved of truths finally spoken. And Jesse reached out, tentative yet certain, his rough fingers brushing hers before clasping firm, not as a hired hand or a man unworthy, but as an equal willing to stand beside her against whatever seasons came next. And Clara felt the weight she had carried since opening that attic journal lift from her shoulders. because every page had led her here, not to a grave, but to a second chance. And together they turned toward the mouth of the canyon where open prairie awaited, riding side by side beneath the sky-washed gold by setting sun. A promise, once carved in ink, now carried forward in living breath, no longer hidden in dust but spoken plain across the wide western horizon.